Illinois' gun and magazine ban found unconstitutional by a federal judge, but that permanent injunction has been stayed for 30 days by the judge, giving time for the state to file an appeal. Welcome in. It's Friday, a late Friday. I'm on the road, but we've got breaking news from the Southern District of Illinois Federal Courts, and I'll read the story to you here as found at thecentersquare.com. Federal judge in East St. Louis found Illinois' gun and magazine ban is unconstitutional and enjoined the state from enforcement, but stayed that ruling for 30 days for the state to appeal. Here's a quote. "The Protect Illinois Communities Act is an unconstitutional affront to the Second Amendment and must be enjoined." That's a quote from federal Judge Stephen McGlynn, issued Friday in a 168-page ruling. He said that the government may not deprive law-abiding citizens of their guaranteed right to self-defense as a means of offense. The court will stay enforcement of the permanent injunction for 30 days. Now, Illinois banned the sale and possession of more than 170 semi-automatic firearms and magazines over certain capacities in January 2023. Federal lawsuits were followed shortly thereafter. Now, the state argues that the banned firearms are too similar to military firearms and dangerous and unusual, and banning them is for public safety. But plaintiffs, they argued that commonly owned firearms need to be available, and banning them violates the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. Now, 4 consolidated cases in the Southern District were ultimately ruled on in a preliminary injunction in the spring of 2023. And after granting that preliminary injunction against the law in April of 2023, the state appealed. McGlynn's preliminary injunction only lasted for 6 days last year. But the U.S. 7th Circuit Court of Appeals ultimately ruled in favor of the state on preliminary grounds. But then the case was put back into the district courts, where McGlynn held a 4-day bench trial in September. And after final briefs were filed last month, McGlynn issued his ruling Friday. Now, here's some more quotes from McGlynn's ruling. "The court is also not convinced that weapons like the AR-15 and its relatives are, quote, dangerous and unusual." McGlynn also criticized the state's prohibition on limiting magazine capacities. "This court holds that these devices are also in common use and have legitimate self-defense purposes. Quote, for magazines, every round matters in a self-defense scenario. Reloading takes away significant time during which the defender can be injured or wounded." Now, when the preliminary injunction issues were debated in the Court of Appeals, the majority of the 3-judge panel argued that semi-automatic firearms like the AR-15 were too similar to military firearms that could be switched to full auto. McGlynn pushed back on that with his final judgment order on Friday. Quote, "Therefore, the court holds that military use refers to weapons that are selected, procured, tested, and issued to military members for use in combat. With this in mind, none of the weapons, magazines, or attachments prohibited by PICA can be called military grade, since they were not issued to the military for use in combat." Supporters of the gun ban, they say that the law is needed to keep people safe from bad actors who may use such firearms in a mass shooting, as was done in Highland Park July 4th of 2022. But Judge McGlynn saying, while the court's sympathetic to those who've lost loved ones to gun violence, such tragedies are not an excuse to restrict the rights guaranteed to the Illinois public by the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution. He goes on to say, regardless of state government's desire to restrict law-abiding citizens' Second Amendment rights under the guise of crime control, the Second Amendment conclusively protects law-abiding citizens' rights to defend themselves utilizing weapons that are in common use. Ultimately, McGlynn, he said that the government did not meet the burden to prove the history and tradition of firearms regulations, supporting PICA's expansive sweep covering hundreds of models of weapons, magazines, and attachments used by tens of millions of law-abiding United States citizens. The Second Amendment Foundation praised McGlynn's ruling. Alan Gottlieb said this is a great victory for the Second Amendment Foundation and the right to keep and bear arms. The gun prohibition lobby and their bought and paid for politicians just suffered a big defeat. An appeal from the states to the 7th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals is expected. So that's the latest here on a Friday afternoon into the evening before a holiday weekend with Illinois in Focus Daily. We'll be back with you live on Tuesday morning after observing the Veterans Day holiday weekend, but figured we'd give you this late breaking news here out of the Southern District of Illinois Federal Courts, where Judge Stephen McGlynn ruled against the state's ban on firearms and magazines over certain capacities. ultimately saying it violates the Second Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. We'll be tracking this where it goes from here to the 7th Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals and beyond. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell, and get the podcast anywhere you get podcasts. Just search Illinois in Focus Daily.